It's nice to be together with everyone this Shabbat morning. So you may have heard about the recent election in Israel. Not actually the one that seems to now be likely to see the end of the premiership of Bibi Netanyahu, the longest serving prime minister in Israel's history, in favor of an unlikely coalition of parties led by two called Yamina and New Hope, as well as for the first time, the inclusion of a small bloc of Arab Knesset members as well. But I'm not referring to that coalition. Instead, I'm referring to the very small and secret ballot of Knesset members who recently elected Israel's 11th president, former Labor Knesset member, unsuccessful candidate for prime minister, and most recently the chairman of the Jewish Agency, Isaac Herzog, better known to many as Bougie. Bougie, a nickname his Egyptian mother is said to have given him, is a scion of what amounts to political royalty in Israel. Some refer to his family as the Kennedys of the Holy Land. His grandfather and namesake was the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Israel. His uncle was famed Israeli diplomat Abba Eban, and his father, Chaim Herzog, was also president of Israel. There were two touching pictures of Herzog sent around the world among many last week. One was of him kneeling at the grave of his father at Har Herzl, and the other was of him in casual clothes and sneakers, shopping for groceries for Shabbat on Friday morning. It was not a posed picture, the second one anyway. It is clearly just what this political scion of Zion, I made that up myself, by the way, does on Fridays. He is known by those who know him to be a very humble and down-to-earth individual, and the election in the Knesset was, by all reports, a landslide. It is a good week to talk about leadership because that is the theme of Parshat Korach. Korach and his band, as I mentioned before, all level strong accusations against Moses and Aaron, saying to them, "You have gone too far, for all the community are holy, all of them, and the Lord is in their midst. Why then do you raise yourselves above the Lord's congregation?" Much has been written about the motivation of Korach and those who followed him. Many identify Korach as the biblical archetype of a demagogue, willing to hurl accusations at current leadership, to touch on populist sentiments without depth or plans to actually make whatever is actually wrong any better. Yitz Greenberg, writing on the Parsha Weekly for Hadar, states clearly what the reader assumes about the motivations of the God-appointed leadership against whom Korach seeks to foment rebellion for his own benefit. Following the miraculous swallowing of Korach and his band in a pit opened just for them, and following the affirmation of Aaron's leadership by a miraculous flowering staff, Rabbi Greenberg writes, the Israelites now understand that Aaron and the Levites are role models who are representing the people and protecting their lives. Holy ones do not lord it over anyone, but work to honor the God of life and uplift the life of all people. These are two pretty good goals for leadership in a religious context. Honor the God of life and uplift the life of all the people. We have in almost all contexts here, and many countries around the world have joined us in losing sight of these expectations for leaders. Sadly, that sweeping but accurate generalization includes Israel. An ultra-Orthodox party that will be shut out of the new ruling coalition lashed out at the prime minister designate, Naftali Bennett, a kippah-wearing, self-described Orthodox Jew, as an evil, wicked, reform Jew who will rot. Perhaps more disturbingly, yes, even more disturbingly than that, a Times of Israel article reported that a day after the head of the Shin Bet Security Service urged politicians to express themselves responsibly and avoid radicalized discourse amid rising incitement, Likud Knesset member May Golan called the right-wing leaders of the so-called change bloc suicide bombers. She was referring both to the likely next prime minister of Israel and a likely minister, Gideon Sa'ar, himself an odds-on future candidate for Israel's highest office. And she was asked by her interviewer a number of times if that is really what she meant, if perhaps she wouldn't like to go back and choose a different word, if she would like to rephrase using less violent language. She did not wish to rephrase and instead repeated this language. Having recently read Ehud Barak's autobiography and also having had the chance to watch Oslo, an HBO movie version of a play about the origins of the peace process that unfolded through the 90s, and following this week's news and the power of Korach's language to incite a rebellion, I'm like, does no one hear what they are saying? Have they forgotten that words have consequences? Have you forgotten that it was incendiary and hateful words mainly that led directly to Prime Minister Rabin's death? What happened to the supposed national reckoning following that cataclysmic event? Rabin was propagandized in a Nazi uniform, wearing a keffiyeh by the radical right. Now a right-wing Knesset member calls out another self-described, self-defined right-wing leader as a suicide bomber? Where do they think this leads? There will be no divine pits that will open up to show who is God's chosen. As I spoke about last night, since the biblical era, God has opted out of direct and obvious intervention in history and has left it to us to decide how to live out God's own hopes for everything from our individual lives to Israel's success and to the fate of humanity. And it is hard to believe that harsh, inflammatory, and even murderous invective gets us closer to the ideal version of any of these aspirations. So we should distance ourselves from those who think such vitriol is the best way forward. How we speak, whose speech we admire and hold up as an example for ourselves and others, what we call out and critique as beyond acceptable or decry as potentially destructive, that at least we get to choose. The outgoing president of Israel, office which is prescribed to a single 7-year term, is Reuven Rivlin, a Likud politician who has served by all public accounts as a steadfast spokesman for the unity of worldwide Jewry and as an advocate for the multiculturalism and religious and ethnic diversity that helped to define the modern state of Israel. His pleas for calm after the recent riots and vigilantism in mixed Arab and Jewish towns were some of the most heartfelt I heard. At times over these last few years, when relations between Israel's government and some parts of the Jewish community here in the United States were strained, like in the aftermath of the cancellation of the Kotel deal that was brokered by Natan Sharansky, it was President Rivlin who traveled to the diaspora to remind us of what should still hold us together. While I don't agree with all of his stances or priorities, he reflected what Israel's mostly ceremonial president should be: an honorable advocate for peace, security, the proper functioning of the government, and increased understanding between groups that don't always or even often see eye to eye. For his affirming the importance of the partnership of Jews worldwide in Israel's present and future, we are and should be grateful. One more anecdote about Israel's presidency. Well, actually, 1.5 anecdotes. The half anecdote is that it is reported that 2 prime ministers recruited Elie Wiesel to be Israel's president, but he declined both times. The fuller anecdote is that we know, because of an exchange of letters that is part of the historical record, that after Chaim Weizmann died, Ben-Gurion's first choice for Israel's second president was, do you know? Albert Einstein. Einstein declined. Some say it was because of his commitment to universalist humanitarianism, but that is not what he wrote in response to the offer to move to Israel and to accept its presidency. I could not remember previously seeing this letter. If you are familiar with it, then I'm impressed. Professor Einstein wrote, "I am deeply moved by the offer from our state of Israel to serve as president, and at once saddened and ashamed that I cannot accept it. All my life I have dealt with objective matters. Hence I lack both the natural aptitude and the experience to deal properly with people and to exercise official functions. For these reasons alone, I should be unsuited to fulfill the duties of that high office, even if advancing age was not masking increasing inroads on my strength. I am the more distressed over these circumstances because my relationship to the Jewish people has become my strongest human bond ever since I became fully aware of our precarious situation among the nations of the world." I promised you a whole anecdote, so here's how it ends. The invitation from Ben-Gurion was carried to Einstein by Israel's long-serving ambassador to the United States and the United Nations, Abba Eban. And you may recall from just a few minutes ago that Eban was the uncle of Israel's next president, Isaac Herzog. Israel is a small country, and we are a small, interconnected people, responsible one for the other wherever we reside. We are at our best when we model for those we know and those we don't how critical it is to choose our words carefully. When we demonstrate how to support and affirm the power and necessity of constructive, collaborative, and forward-thinking leadership. When we seek to balance the pride that comes from being part of an entity blessed uniquely but not exclusively by God, with the humility that comes from understanding that we are part of something larger than our own individual needs and desires. In our Parsha, Korach accuses Moses of lifting himself up above everyone else, and Moses' response internally and externally is to fall down to the ground in humility. But he gets up, engages with the rebels and the demagogues, makes his case on behalf of the budding nation, and God affirms that his approach is the correct one. Through our intentions and actions, the ways we lead and the ways we follow, and especially how willing we are to engage deeply with our tradition and history so that the Jewish future will be secure, we affirm that the example of our greatest teacher remains our gold standard, which we might not achieve, but toward which we can all strive. Shabbat Shalom. Continue with Musaf, which we turn back in our Sidurim to page 155.